everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Natalia Leigh. I'm an indie author and freelance editor, and today I am giving you my top 7 tips for how to write strong villains, the type of villains that people love to hate or at least feel bad about loving. So if you are interested in grabbing some tips for how to write your villain, then stay tuned. Let's get started. So before I get started, I want to give a special shout out to Custom Novel Covers, who is sponsoring today's video. If you are looking for an affordable cover design, make sure to check out their link. It is in the description below, as well as a discount code if you do decide to work with them. Go check them out and maybe you can get a custom cover for your novel. Okay, let's go ahead and dive right into our tips. So my first tip for writing strong villains is to spend time developing your villains. Now, I've had some experience with this. When I first wrote Pistol Daisy, I'm always going to reference Pistol Daisy, which is coming out June 9th if you're interested. Anyway, when I first wrote Pistol Daisy, my villain was just like your typical bad guy, and I hadn't spent any time developing his character. And what I learned was that I didn't really develop his backstory or, his history, what led him up to this point, because he wasn't really on screen very often. And I think it's easy for us to forget to develop our villains because typically we're not seeing them in the action all that often. We're following the story of the hero, and the hero is probably going to come into conflict with this villain every so often, definitely like in the big climax at the end of the book. But we're not usually seeing villains very often, so I think it's easy for us to forget that we have to develop them, but it's incredibly important. So you might want to ask yourself, what is the history of this villain? What happened to them when they were growing up? Did they have like a tragic past? Did they have terrible things that happened to them that made them this way? What made them into the villain? What made them the bad guy? By asking yourself these questions and really taking the time to develop your villain's backstory, you will be making them a much more complex character, and they will feel more realistic to your readers, which is really what we want. I can't stand when I pick up a book and the villain is just a bad guy because he wants to be a bad guy. That doesn't feel realistic and it doesn't feel compelling. And that's going to take us into my second tip, which is to give your villain a strong want. And I've talked about this in terms of your hero as well, your main character. Your main character needs to want something, and they need to be working toward that thing that they want. A villain needs to have a want as well. So what do they want? Why do they want it? Give them some motivation. And typically, we have what the hero wants and we have what the villain wants, and that's usually putting them into direct conflict with one another. So if your villain doesn't want anything and they're just being a bad guy because they want to be, that's not interesting, that's not compelling enough, and that's not a strong enough villain. So give your villain something that they're fighting for, something that they're working for, and put that in opposition to your main character. Okay, my third tip is to make your villain complex. Granted, all of these tips are going to help develop this and kind of play into this, but something that I like to think of is that even the most terrible, horrible people sometimes do nice things. They sometimes do good things. So when I'm talking about, like in this case, making your villain complex, I'm going to kind of try to push you to show your villain in different types of light. Of course, we're going to have them in the villainous light where they are doing everything they can to stop your hero on their journey and to kind of sabotage all their plans, and they can absolutely be mostly in that villainous light. But what are the little good things that your villain does? What are the small little nice things that your villain does? By developing that side of them a little bit more and allowing readers to see that side of them, you're giving them more like three-dimensionality. They're not just this one-dimensional flat character on the page who's just always the big mean bad guy. Make them come to life. Give them different personality quirks, make them complex. Let us see them being the horrible bad guy, and let us see this person being a nice guy, doing gentle things. And that'll really help their personality come to life on the page instead of just being flat, boring, and bad. Okay, tip number 4 is to give your villain moments of vulnerability and relatability. And I know this isn't going to work for every single villain. It is kind of going to depend on who that villain is and how you're writing them. but there's something about vulnerability and relatability that really allows us to connect to one another and therefore to connect with characters in a story. So even if you have a terrible, wicked, horrible villain, if they have a moment of vulnerability and readers can connect with them, it's going to give your reader all the feels for that character. And I know that what I really love in a good villain is that, sure, I love to hate them, but there are some villains, my very favorite villains, who I love, and you kind of feel bad for loving them because they're such wicked, horrible people most of the time. But by showing their vulnerable side and allowing them to connect with readers and to feel relatable, it's really going to make them feel like they're not just the villain. They're coming to life on the page. Sure, they're doing villainous things, but they're actually a person, and your readers can therefore connect to that person. So if you can, try to break out of the typical cliches of how the bad guy works and how the villain works, and give them those moments where readers can kind of see the cracks. They can kind of peek behind the curtain, I guess you could say, and see who that person really is, who that villain really is, and see their vulnerability. And I think that's really going to help readers connect to your villain and love them or love to hate them. Okay, this next tip, tip number 5, is actually one of my favorites. I absolutely love this, and it's because this is something that I really worked at for Pistol Daisy, and that is, tip number 5, is to try to consider the story from your villain's perspective. I think it's very easy for us to just say, okay, we have the hero and we have the bad guy, and that's just who they are. But I think it's important to remember that your villain believes that they're the hero. They are the protagonist in their own story. So I would challenge you to kind of flip the script and look at your story from the perspective of your villain as the protagonist and as the hero of the story. You know, what if it's your main character who is, you know, in opposition to your villain, and they're the bad guy. They are the one getting in the way of what your villain wants. So if you can really kind of turn the story around, step into your villain's shoes and look at the story from their perspective, I think you'll learn so much more about their motivation, why they want what they want, why they're doing these things, why they are in direct conflict with your main character. And again, remember, like I said before, that your villain believes they are the hero of the story. They believe that they are the protagonist. They don't see themselves as the villain in your story. So I think if you take time to kind of sink into that, you know, maybe write up a few like writing prompts. Take some time to just write chapters of your book from your villain's perspective. This could be really good too if you're feeling stuck with your villain, if you are feeling, you know, a little bit of writer's block, which I typically don't really believe in, which I could talk about in a video. If you're interested, let me know down below. You know, if you're just feeling stuck, maybe switch it up and write your conflict scenes or your chapters where, you know, your hero and your villain are coming into direct opposition with one another. Write that from both your hero's perspective and your villain's perspective, and see if that gives you any more insight into who your villain is, why they're doing the things they're doing, and, you know, how to bring them to life and therefore bring the story to life at the same time. Okay, tip number 6. I really love this one as well, and it is to allow your villain to win. There is nothing more boring than a villain who says, I'm a bad guy because I want to be a bad guy and I'm gonna get you. And then they never do. They never follow through. Nothing ever happens. They never win. Your hero just vanquishes them at every step along the way, and that's not a fun story to read. I want to see the villain win sometimes, because then it makes us feel more worried that the hero might fail. And I think that's really important. Readers need to be convinced that the hero could potentially fail at what they're trying to do. And the hero does sometimes fail in stories. You know, I can think of books and movies where you get to the end and the hero is not successful in their journey, and it just makes the story feel so much more important and so much more like visceral and alive when you think, when you know, this villain is capable of completely like demolishing my hero. This villain might destroy them. They might win. And if you give your villain some wins up to that point, then it really communicates to readers that they are going to make good on their threats. They're going to follow through with what they say they're going to do. and they are a worthy opponent. I think that's really important too. If you have this hero who is always winning and the villain is never really getting in their way, the villain is never able to win anything, then that's not a worthy opponent for your hero. That's not a worthy villain. I want to see a villain who could really, go head to head with your hero and potentially win. And of course, in every story, we're going to have those ups and downs, kind of like that roller coaster of emotions and roller coaster of action that's happening. So there should definitely be low moments where your hero is failing or losing. And then there's going to be those high moments where they are succeeding, they're vanquishing the villain, etc. But give your villain some wins along the way. Tip number 7 is going to be to give your villain a system of beliefs and a moral code. Because I think it, again, like all of these tips are going to help you create a more complex villain, really bring your villain to life. And I think an aspect of that, again, is like, where does your villain draw the line? Because I think most villains, almost everybody, they have that line that they're not going to cross. Even if they are a terrible, horrible, no good, scum of the earth person, they probably have a line that they're not going to cross. For example, do they, have a really close relationship with a sibling or a parent, and they would never, ever do anything to harm that person? If you can give your villain some humanity by giving them a belief system and giving them a moral code, again, I think it makes them come to life, because they're not just the big bad guy doing bad things because they want to be the evil person and get in the way of your hero. That is boring. Nobody wants to read about that type of villain. We want to read about the villains that have a code, a moral code, a system of beliefs. They have motivation and a reason why they're doing things. They believe they're the good guy, or at least they are the protagonist of their own story, and they see your main character as the one getting in the way. Your main character is their villain. I want to see this. I want to see the vulnerability. I want to see the humanity. And that way, I can connect to that villain. And again, I'm going to say this over and over. I love villains. Villains tend to be some of my favorite characters if they're done well. And I think one of the reasons is because I tend, especially recently, like in recent years, I tend to really become bored by characters who are just like light and positive and they always do good things. I find that really boring. So I love when there's a villain in a story who can do morally gray things. They can do bad things, they can do good things. Like, they really are a complex character, just like all of us are. And that's actually something that I'm kind of exploring in Pistol Daisy, which, again, I'm gonna keep saying it. It comes out on June 9th. Paperback and ebook comes out June 9th. But something I'm exploring in Pistol Daisy is villains, is the idea of being the bad guy. In Daisy's story, there is a villain. His name is Hopkins, and I have done a lot of work to develop him, and I love him, and I'm so excited to get to spend more time with him. But at the same time, I'm exploring the idea of a main character, a good character, being Daisy, becoming a bit of a villain themselves. I mean, this is a Wild West story about a gunslinger and a young woman seeking revenge for the murder of her family. And in doing so, it's very possible that she could cross some lines. It's very possible that she could become the bad guy in somebody else's story. And I like get little goosebumps talking about it, because I love the idea of exploring the gray area of morality, exploring the gray area between what is right and what is wrong, and how that works, how that plays out in life, how that plays out in stories. So I'm really glad that I got to kind of give you guys my thoughts on villains today. You guys voted for this. Over 650 people voted. Last time I checked, 671 people had voted for this video. So thank you so much to everybody who voted. I will, of course, have another poll up on my channel very soon. We are less than 2 weeks out from Pistol Daisy release, from the Pistol Daisy release, I should say. And I am so excited. I'm like pretty calm about it, but inside I am very excited about this release. I've worked so hard on this book. Again, I will say it over and over because people keep asking me, will there be a paperback version? Yes, it's right here. If you want to get the paperback version, it comes out on June 9th. We've got some gorgeous little illustrations in there. I am so proud of this book. I really hope you'll love it if you decide to read it, and I hope over the course of the series you might come to enjoy Hopkins and the other villainous characters in this series as much as I enjoy them. Okay guys, that is all I have for you today. Come visit us at www.enchantedinkpublishing.com if you are looking for editing or formatting services, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!